What you're watching now are the existing clips from the first horror film ever made in the Philippines by a Filipino. This film is Ang Manananggal, which was released back in the year 1927, and as you could guess, is now currently lost. It was directed by Jose Nepomuceno, who is known as the founder of Philippine movies. He's the same guy who made what is considered to be the first narrative Filipino feature film in general, which was Dalagang Bukid back in 1919. Little is known about these movies because they no longer exist. We can infer that this film is about the Mananangal based on the title alone. Now, a quick explanation for those of you unfamiliar with the Mananangal is that it is a creature of myth, very much like the vampire. It possesses the same level of iconic stature here in the Philippines. The most notable aspect about it is exactly what its name describes. It can be roughly translated to the one who separates, coming from the root word tanggal, which means to separate or detach. This is because this creature detaches its upper body from its lower body, right at the waist. This is after it sprouts bat-like wings, which are what enable it to then go around swiftly and wreak havoc. Again, like a vampire, it thirsts for the life force of humans. It has a notable preference for infants, especially those still unborn. They have extending proboscis-like tongues as sharp as a needle to target pregnant women sleeping in their homes. It can be repelled and harmed by garlic or salt. So putting that on the detached legs would prevent it from turning back to human form, and then it would be vanquished through exposure to the coming sunlight. So there's likely a lot of familiar elements you're already noticing here, not only from classic Eastern European vampire myth, but way more from the other vampiric creatures of Southeast Asia. Note that the Manananggal is sort of related to the aswang, which is a monster that is arguably even more popular here. So that would deserve a video on its own, but I want to focus on the Manananggal because of its status as the first Filipino movie monster ever, even if it no longer exists. There isn't a surviving frame left of the movie that can be found anywhere, as far as I know. There are almost no statements about the quality or content of the movie itself. One of the very few remaining descriptions of the actual movie is from this review by Jose Quirino, and I quote, "Even with the crudest equipment, Nepomuceno was able to conjure camera tricks. In one scene where Mary Walter in the title role and her fellow Manananggals appeared to be half-bodied before a coffin, Don Jose had a portion of the ground excavated, and the actors and actresses who portrayed Manananggals therefore were filmed buried up to the waistline. Subsequent editing made them appear limbless to terrified moviegoers." So that reminded me of the same type of ingenuity found in other early silent films like the works of Georges Méliès. And since there's nothing but this big Manananggal-shaped void in our early film history, I wanted to fill that up with speculation and imagination. I really could not stop asking myself, what if this movie was never lost? This is because I see the level of influence that other early monster movies have on the horror genre as a whole. This comes especially from movies based on the vampire, which similarly was just a simple and popular folktale, but made from the other side of the world. Now, every culture on Earth has their own version of this life-sucking archetype, yet the one most famous and well explored is the one of European descent. The West had always had the advantage of creating, archiving, and distributing their literary stories, and then soon also their movies. So I want to look at 3 early vampire movies that set the foundation for the conventions of horror cinema, and then afterwards, think about how an early Manananggal movie could have created a different influence on the genre. We're starting in 1922 with Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau. As classic and as renowned as early silent cinema can get, it spread the vampire myth to the minds of people across the globe on its way to becoming arguably the most influential horror film ever made. It was one of the biggest figures in the German Expressionist movement, which pushed horror into stylized worlds, which expressed psychological states. It's really impressive that Nosferatu was one of the very few examples of these movies not made in a meticulously designed and distorted set. It was shot on real locations which are inherently tied to the story. The vampire is a count isolated up in a castle, a setting that has dark corridors and rigid materiality. The vampire is living in ruins whose very stones remind us of just how undead the place is. The cold, empty, inhuman space becomes a staple of horror cinema immediately. It also did a lot to create the ideal shape and posture of a threat in cinema, not to mention how it moves. This is probably the most iconic scene. Count Orlok walks slowly and directly into the camera. It's sort of in the shape of a person, but it's huge, it barely fits the doorway. This is how a lot of dread was rendered with monsters. Lighting and shadow was also used in order to accentuate its ghastly figure. It's often said that the movements and posture of Freddy Krueger was based on Count Orlok, and it's easy to see. I think other slashers take from it too, notoriously the eerily slow but imposing Michael Myers. The whole premise of It Follows is about how scary someone slowly walking towards you is. It even has that scene when the huge lanky man walks through the doorway. But the movie that Nosferatu had the biggest influence on could probably be Dracula. And that's because they were based on the same book, Bram Stoker's Dracula. This one took the original name because it actually had the rights to the story, so it's definitely more faithful to the book. The movie ended up being the cultural touchstone responsible for pop culture's perception of the vampire mythos. Nowadays, wherever the vampire is portrayed, it's likely referencing this movie. It was made in 1931, so this one now is a talkie. It has a ton of dialogue, very quotable stuff from an iconic performance by Bela Lugosi that permanently set the image of a vampire. This movie solidified the idea of the vampire as a nobleman, a wealthy aristocrat. He's still strange and foreign, but definitely has more charm than Count Orlok. So this is the one that opened up some psychosexual interpretations that's inherently part of the vampire story, which less censored films of the future would build on. These ideas really caught on. It became a very successful franchise piece. It is the complete opposite of the next movie I will talk about, which did not do so well at the time. Vampire by Carl Theodor Dreyer came out a year later, and it was unsuccessful upon release, but it has since garnered the acclaim that it deserves as an innovator in cinematic form and a new step into horror art. That long-delayed appreciation is understandable because it clearly didn't go for the same pop appeal direction as Dracula. It instead seemed like it was really trying to blow some minds at the time. The reality within the narrative is incoherent, the dialogue is confusing or disposable. You can't really tell if it's day or night. It feels like a nightmare. Definitely horrific, but have you ever shared the story of your nightmare? It doesn't make sense in the logic of reality. But it does have this strong sense of the scary and creepy and atmospheric. It even has those spatial impossibilities that dreams have that many future horror films use. It had a dynamic camera for its time, and it does some really cool blocking and imagery all the time. It's very hypnotic, which just fits with the power of the vampire. How it executed horror is different. Continuing that feeling of being lost, the movie makes its horrific acts unseen. Sometimes you're waiting and waiting for this sudden jump that just doesn't happen. The vampire has little actual screen time. These descriptions can probably fit some horror scenes in your head already. Many credit that technique of maximizing the fear of the monster by minimizing its screen time with Jaws. I see this type of horror in the space-shifting, insomniac nightmare of Ingmar Bergman's Hour of the Wolf, the serial dancing of bodies and camera in Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon, and the atmospheric and confused reality of David Lynch's Eraserhead. I think this could also be the first instance I've seen that classic horror scene where a character is studying about a monster's behavior while the movie cross-cuts with that being performed. A trope that even influences the future iteration of Dracula. It also actually flips the script when it decides the vampire shall be a woman, subverting that colonial fear that the story of Dracula tapped into, of a foreign man invading and getting too comfortable with local women. The portrayal of the vampire here is even kinda androgynous and anti-erotic, deviating from some major undertones of the original piece and its many interpretations. But speaking of deviation via female bloodsuckers, let's get back to the main topic of this video. What influence could the film Ang Manananggal have had if it was never lost? Based on what we know about the Mananangal, how much could it have deviated from the horror conventions that vampire movies had set? I know it's a lot of speculation, but I hope you just indulge me in just fantasizing for a bit about what could have been. Having an alternate route to achieve horror in cinema would be perfect, since creating fear, anxiety, and shock greatly values the unexplored and unexpected. So speaking of exploration, let's first talk about where these stories take place. Remember what I said about Nosferatu, isolated up in a castle, dark corridors, rigid materials, cold, empty, inhuman ruins. Well, the Manananggal hunts in the deep jungle or forest. Instead, there's tons of moving parts, living things. It's not up in a tower, mountains away from civilization. Its hunting grounds can surround an entire village. So there's a different type of horror that can come out of that. We all know how great Nosferatu was in making creepy scenes in places like these. But I feel like there could have been a lot to build on in a wild nature setting where the built environment would have been comprised of fragile huts. Some scholars even say that the fear of the Manananggal has influenced architectural designs of early Filipino houses by constructing with steep pitched roofs and strategically placed windows. These are the homes that the Manananggal would infiltrate. They don't have a castle that we find ourselves trapped in. They come to our place. Now that's scary, of course. Again, the most iconic moment of Nosferatu is the vampire slowly coming right at us, even towards the camera itself. So how would that camera behave when the threat is not on the same plane as us? Not at all eye level. And this is another well-known shot from Nosferatu, a classic low-angle shot utilized in every other horror film now. It makes the monster more imposing and forces a point of view that makes you uneasy. Now imagine this, but all the time, because the Manananggal is always flying right above our heads. That would have been a challenge to consistently frame and light, so it would have been cool to see how they would work around that. The height of Nosferatu naturally creates a low-angle shot for an average person. Size is an easy way to make a monster imposing and threatening. So what if our monster was half the size of a person? How would that figure dominate a frame like Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger? What forms would horror cinema adjust into in order to make this specific half-sized monster scarier? It would be a challenge in itself to shoot that illusion, especially for the time. And even more difficult to capture would be how the Manananggal moves. I talked a lot about the slowness of the vampire. It makes sense for a genre trying to harness as much tension and dread out of an audience. It made the monster feel sick or even dead, or like an inevitable doom. So what happens when, instead, our monster is deadly because of its swiftness? Some even say part of the Manananggal's transformation process is chanting "Kas, Kas, Kas," which in Bicol refers to speed or being fast. This is before it takes flight at extreme speed. So this not only creates a more dynamic subject for a horror movie, but also potential for a dynamic staging and framing. How can this quick-moving monster be captured by a camera? And more specifically, how could the early filmmakers create a solution to that dilemma with limited technology? And could this solution possibly have led to different methods of shooting horror films today? Flipping our lenses on its head is kind of a thing that the manananggal does, even in the literal sense too. I hear this attribute for witches and aswangs in general. When you look into their eyes, the reflected image is upside down. There are also accounts of perspective illusions that if you see an aswang in front of you, that actually means that it's right behind you. It was also a very common idea that mythic creatures in Philippine folklore try to keep you in circles, lost and hopeless. How would that have changed the views and perspectives being used in this genre built on looking towards an oncoming threat in front of your eyes? This is the same of how the manananggal hunts with sound illusion. Sometimes they are accompanied by a tik-tik or a wak-wak on their hunt. These are monstrous birds that serve as omens. The names are automatopoeias for the sound they produce. What's so notable about this sound is that when it's loud, that means it's still very far away. But when it gets soft and quiet, that means that it's already right next to you. This is the complete opposite of how we've evolved to react to the threats around us. That confusion helps the manananggal hunt. So how would this tricky sensory experience be represented in a genre that is so dependent on sonic elements to build fear? Vampire played with this element the most. Dreyer was a master of silent filmmaking, and this was his first sound film, so there are some parts where it stays loyal to the silent medium. On the same year Vampire came out, 1932, there was an article announcing the first ever optically synchronized sound film in the Philippines. That movie would be Ang Aswang. Its dialogue would be recorded in Spanish and English though, even publicized with the title The Vampire, probably to reach a wider global audience. But apparently this dialogue was not completely in sync. Those who watched the film pointed out that it wasn't a completely sound film. It's very likely then that the first sound film in the Philippines was actually Punyal na Ginto, directed by no other than Jose Nepomuceno. We all know a sound could surprise or creep us out, but what really brings out a profound fear is context. The uniqueness of a Mananangal movie won't all be boiled down to the technical aspect. Translating Ang Aswang to The Vampire also just doesn't get it right. The core stories between these monsters could differ more than we think at first glance. One of the major sources of horror in Dracula is the fear of the outsider. The differing locations don't just affect our visual experience but give context that vastly shape our perception of the character and their place in the world. Count Dracula is an aristocrat up in a solitary castle from a far-off land who invades your town. There's a lot of notable class dynamics and sociological concepts about xenophobia that play there already. So what kind of fears and lines of thought could be made out of a story where the monster is more so among us? They're identical to us by day, possibly even interacting with us on an average day. I want to see how these hunting stories take place in the typical Filipino tight-knit circles where large social gatherings are commonly held. How might this have expressed the specific details of how a small Filipino town behaves? Would we as audiences to this be able to trace the reasoning behind the creation of the Mananangal concept to the specific attributes of Philippine culture? A basic way to think about it is, we want our kids to stop going outside at night, so we tell them there's a monster who hunts at night for little kids. This idea, of course, extends to people mistrusting others who don't have religious artifacts in their home like everyone else. We all love to prepare food in various sauces and seasonings, so a nasty inversion of that personality would be someone who eats raw, unclean food and avoids stuff like salt and garlic. I mean, that's how cultures create monsters. They find a trait that would be so subversive to what their shared values are. Which brings us to one of the biggest differences between the vampire and the manananggal: its gender. The manananggal is notably female. It has plenty of traits that are inherently tied to society's perception of women. Its victims are mostly other women, mothers, and unborn children. When it decides to prey on men, it does so through seduction or infiltration via marriage. The manananggal also has a tendency to attack newlyweds. From these factors alone, you can see a characterization of envy. The monster seems to have come from a place where women's lives are assumed to revolve around becoming a man's wife and bearing his children. This could be what was seen as so horrific and transgressive about a woman who removes their reproductive organs, who goes around freely at night with no clothes, no husband, no child, and no God. It's unsure how much Spanish colonization could have influenced this myth, but the idea is not unfounded. The Spanish Catholics arrived and witnessed women enjoying equal and sometimes even higher social status than men, while being respected religious leaders and possessing more agency politically, spiritually, and sexually. This went against the core beliefs that the colonizers constantly forced upon Filipinos. The vital and respective roles of shamans, healers, and midwives were demonized. The reason we will likely never uncover how exactly the myth was formed originally and then subsequently influenced by colonizers is because the ancient texts and artifacts that traced back the myth's conception are now lost. But lost is a misleading word to apply to things that were erased with intent, as part of conquest. A profound Manananggal story could have set precedents for some alternative representations of various social phenomena in film history. It could have served as a significant cultural artifact from its specific time period. A rich cinematic foundation of this legend could have produced further dissections of how these important ideas would have been expressed and perceived by different social movements throughout history. It's worth remembering, though, that early film producers here only included wealthy Spaniards, American businessmen, and some Filipino landlords and politicians. So these movies from pre-war Philippines were restrained in expressing views that might question establishments in the status quo. Instead, they were encouraged to portray the love and reconciliation between members of different classes, such as in Dalagang Bukid. Well, we can't say for sure to what extent that description fits. Again, there's no existing text to analyze here anymore. But I could bring up an old surviving review again. This film review from the Citizen newspaper didn't really comment on how the story of Dalagang Bukid upholds the status quo of its time, but it did talk about its revolutionary potential as a piece of good art from the Philippines. And I quote, "It is a sad truth to mention that our country is practically unknown in most parts of the globe. Now, more than ever, the world needs much enlightenment with regard to our situation, so that our foreign commerce may expand and tourists may visit our shores. We hope to make the Philippines the veritable Garden of the Far East in the eyes of the commercial world. And to enhance this idea, the motion picture is an essential factor. Pictures depicting the various phases of Philippine life and customs, if exhibited in China, Japan, India, America, Australia, and Europe, will do much toward giving the people of these countries a fair and correct view of our home affairs. It appears therefore highly propitious to develop this all-important industry, which if realized will assist materially in putting the Philippines on the map as an enlightened, progressive, and industrious nation. Because in all likelihood, no matter how great or innovative ang Manananggal could have been, it would still probably not have had the gigantic stature that Nosferatu, Dracula, or Vampire has on film history. It would be more realistically ignored. I mean, around this time, the United States government still wanted to take Filipinos and put them on display in human zoos at World Expos. If they saw early Filipinos like animals, then I'm not so sure they'd be open to taking influence from them. But they knew they weren't animals. They brought films to them to watch in their cities. I think there was just a strong motive for the US government to portray to the American people and the rest of the world that the Philippines was an uncivilized land that needed their benevolent assimilation. And that mission of theirs would be a barrier for a truly successful local industry of any kind. And whatever local film industry the Philippines had went into a halt in 1941, the year Citizen Kane was released, and the year of the Japanese invasion. New films were prevented from getting made. Old films were being destroyed. Invaders outlawed film equipment and commandeered them to make propaganda films. Only Japanese films were being shown, but because of how unsuccessful those were, the propaganda offices hired local filmmakers to make propaganda films for them. Once the war was over, the empty ruins of a local industry led to Hollywood studios easily dominating the market. All of the power structures set by foreign countries always made it more likely that they would be the ones influencing us. And that's exactly what happened in the Mananangal movies made afterwards. Now I'm gonna dive into this history of the Manananggal in Philippine cinema across many different movies and decades. But this video's already gotten long on its own, and that's gonna need a lot of time. So, like the monster we now all know and love, this video is gonna be split into 2 parts. I hope you like this first segment, and I'll be back with the second as soon as I can. Thanks for watching, and happy Halloween.